I still remember the sharp chill in the air that night, even though the restaurant was filled with warmth and laughter just moments earlier. It had been a day of celebration, a day that was supposed to belong entirely to my daughter, Amelia. She had just graduated, the first in our family to do so with honors, and I had never felt prouder. The glow on her face, the joy in her eyes, it was everything I had hoped for. We were all gathered around a long table in a private dining room at her favorite restaurant. Family, friends, some of Peter's colleagues, and a few of Amelia's closest classmates were seated around us, the room buzzing with chatter, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, refilling drinks and delivering plates. The lights were soft, the music gentle, and everything felt just right. Then Peter stood up. He held his glass high and cleared his throat, the signal for silence. Conversations trailed off, and heads turned his way. I smiled, expecting a proud father's speech. Maybe he would talk about how brilliant Amelia was, how much she had grown, or how honored we were to celebrate her achievements. But instead, Peter said, "I've decided to start a new life. Without Emily."
Just like that.
7 words. At first, I wasn't sure I heard him right. My brain took a few seconds to catch up. Then I noticed the room had gone completely silent. Forks hovered midair. Glasses remained untouched. A cousin across the table gasped audibly. All eyes darted between Peter and me. Everyone waited for the explosion. Maybe a scream, a wine glass hurled across the table, or a dramatic sob and rushed exit.
But I just sat there, still,
letting the words settle into my bones like a slow, cold fog. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. Instead, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without saying a word, I handed it to Peter, then turned to my daughter. I kissed her on the cheek and whispered into her ear, "I love you. Always." She sat frozen, her graduation cap still slightly crooked, her eyes wide in disbelief. She looked at me like the floor had just opened beneath her, and she wasn't sure where to stand. I touched her shoulder gently, offering a smile I had rehearsed so many times in the mirror for a moment just like this. Then I stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked out through the restaurant's side exit. I didn't look back. Outside, the night was colder, sharper. But the air felt cleaner, less suffocating. I walked straight to my car, every step measured, my heels tapping softly against the pavement. I didn't rush. I wasn't shaken. I was ready. Just as I reached the car door, I heard footsteps behind me. "Wait, Emily, can we talk?" Peter's voice. Familiar, but suddenly meaningless. I didn't answer. I didn't even turn around. I opened the car door, got in, and shut it quietly behind me. I started the engine. He came up beside the window, tapping lightly, almost pleading. But I kept my eyes forward, hands firm on the wheel. He didn't deserve to see my face anymore. Not after everything. For nearly 30 years, I had supported him through every failed business idea, every dramatic career shift, every phase he labeled soul-searching. I had stood by him when he lost jobs, funded his ventures, and kept the household afloat while he figured himself out. I had sacrificed so much. I turned down job offers that would have changed my life. I gave up dreams I no longer dared to name. I had taken care of Amelia mostly on my own, attending every school meeting, staying up for science projects, helping her apply for college, all while Peter searched for purpose. But I had found something, too. That envelope is now in his hands. It held everything. Signed separation papers, copies of financial statements, a draft property agreement, and a short handwritten note from me that read, "I won't beg." 2 months ago, I noticed something. A small thing at first. I had been reviewing our joint account when I saw a wire transfer of $2,000 to an account labeled C. Wells. I assumed it was a vendor, something related to his latest real estate venture. But the next day, I saw another transaction. Then another. Spa bookings, jewelry stores, hotel stays. All under his name, none of which he ever mentioned to me. That evening, I waited for him to fall asleep. He always placed his phone face down on the nightstand, like a teenager with something to hide. The password hadn't changed. I opened the banking app, quietly took screenshots of every suspicious transaction, and emailed them to myself. Then I checked his messages. That was the first time I saw her name, Cassandra. The messages between them went back almost a year. I sat in the dark scrolling, my breath shallow, my heart quiet. I miss you already. I wish tonight didn't have to end. Once Amelia graduates, I'll be free. One even read, don't worry about the money. She never checks. I turned the phone off, plugged it back in, and returned it to the nightstand. The next morning, he went on his usual jog, claiming he was finally getting back in shape. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the manila folder I had labeled contingency. Until that day, it was empty. Over the next few weeks, I filled it. Every bank transfer, every hotel invoice, copies of texts, photos of receipts. I started recording details. I met with a lawyer Lena had quietly recommended. She had gone through something similar. Her ex had drained her accounts and left her with nothing. I told her what I was planning, and she gave me the name of someone discreet, meticulous, and expensive. I met him at a quiet cafe downtown. I told him everything. No drama, no emotion, just facts. He listened, nodded, and asked a few questions. Then he said, "It's good you came now. You're ahead of the storm." That sentence stuck with me. For once in my life, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't scrambling to catch up to a man who had always spun chaos like thread. I was ahead of the storm. So when Peter stood in that restaurant, lifted his glass, and made his grand little declaration, thinking he was finally taking control of his life, he had no idea the script had already been flipped. He thought he had planned the performance. But so had I. And mine had been in motion long before his. And when we reviewed the prenuptial agreement Peter and I had signed 28 years ago, something important stood out. A single sentence buried in legal language, one I had almost forgotten about myself until the lawyer pointed to it with a pen. A fidelity clause. It was simple, almost too simple, but incredibly powerful. If either party committed infidelity, the faithful spouse would receive full ownership of all jointly acquired assets, home, accounts, investments, everything. Peter had never read the fine print again after all these years. But I had. Many times. In silence. On sleepless nights. With a glass of water trembling in my hand. The lawyer looked up from the paper and smiled gently, not with glee but with a quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what power looked like when it was finally recognized. "If we do this right," he said, tapping the clause again, "you won't just walk away with dignity. You'll walk away with everything you built." I nodded, holding back the tears. I didn't want revenge. That was never what this was about. I wanted freedom. I wanted peace. But I also wanted what I had earned. I hadn't sacrificed decades of my life just to be replaced by a woman with acrylic nails, designer heels, and no clue what it took to build and protect a family through crisis after crisis. 2 weeks before Amelia's graduation, I filed the divorce papers. Quietly. I paid extra for discretion for speed. No drawn-out fights. No scandal. Just preparation. I even signed the papers myself and left a blank space for Peter's signature. I placed the envelope in the entryway drawer, tucked beside the extra house keys and some coupons I no longer needed. And then, 2 nights before the graduation dinner, I packed my bags. I told Peter I was visiting a friend who needed help planning a wedding. He didn't flinch, didn't ask which friend, didn't even pause his scrolling. He grunted, said something like, "Tell her congrats," and returned to his screen. I drove straight to Diana's house. Diana, Peter's younger sister, was the only one in his family who had ever treated me like a full human being. She never took sides without listening, never dismissed me with polite nods or passive silence. When she opened the door and saw the look on my face, she didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around me and held on tight as I finally broke down. The dam I had kept sealed for so long cracked and shattered. I sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe, right there in her foyer. She said nothing. She just held me and rubbed my back like I was the little sister she'd never had. That night, I slept like a child. For the first time in years, I didn't grind my teeth. I didn't wake up in the middle of the night wondering where Peter was or who he was texting. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't pretending. I was free. Not legally, not on paper, not yet, but in all the ways that mattered, I had already walked out of that marriage. The next morning, I sat in Diana's sunlit kitchen, a mug of hot coffee in my hands, watching the light dance across the floor tiles. I was still in my pajamas, hair messy, heart heavy, but lighter than it had been in years. Then came the knock. I didn't need to ask who it was. I felt it before Diana opened the door. Amelia. She stood there with smudged mascara and trembling hands, the confident young woman from the graduation ceremony now replaced by a storm of confusion and pain. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" she whispered. "Why did I have to find out like that?" I stood and walked to her, wrapping my arms around her the way I did when she was little and had nightmares. She held on to me tighter than I expected. "Because you deserved one night that was just about you," I said softly. I didn't want him to ruin that, but he did anyway. We sat down together at the table. I poured her some coffee, then I told her everything. Every bank transfer, every spa booking, every hotel, every text message I had found. Her eyes welled up again, this time not from heartbreak, but fury. "He's disgusting," she said, her voice low and tight. "And Cassandra?" She was there. She sat at our table like she belonged. "I know," I said. "But she isn't the enemy. Not really." He lied to her, too. Amelia shook her head. "I don't care. She showed up at my graduation dinner. She played along. That makes her just as bad." We sat there in silence for a few moments. The truth settled between us, thick and unmoving. Then Diana stepped in from the hallway. "They're here." I didn't ask who. I already knew. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. Peter's car was parked by the curb. He stood beside it, pacing slightly, looking like a man with no idea which direction to face. Cassandra stood behind him, arms crossed, lips pressed tight, not nearly as poised as she'd been the night before. Diana opened the door before they could knock. "We just want to talk," Peter said, his voice a little too fast. I didn't say a word. I stepped aside and let them in. Amelia stood in the living room, her arms folded, her face unreadable. She had positioned herself between me and them like a shield, or maybe like a barrier. She wasn't just angry. She was done. Peter looked around like he was trying to read the temperature of the room. Then he started talking quickly, the way he always did when he was trying to control the narrative. "Emily, I never meant for it to happen like this," he said. "I thought we could handle this privately. You didn't need to freeze the accounts. You didn't need to cheat," I said, my voice calm, steady. Then Cassandra turned to me, her brows furrowed. "Wait. What does she mean, freeze the accounts?" Peter froze. "You didn't tell her?" I asked him directly. "You didn't mention the prenup? Or the part where your infidelity means you lose everything we built together? Or that I filed for divorce weeks ago, and the court approved an emergency motion to freeze joint assets?" Cassandra turned fully toward him now, her arms dropping to her sides. "You said it was handled," she said, voice trembling. "You said you were just waiting to talk to her. You said she agreed to sign." Peter's mouth opened. Closed. No words came out. The silence that followed was worse than yelling. Cassandra shook her head slowly, then looked at me with something that almost resembled respect. But I wasn't interested in earning respect from someone who showed up to my daughter's celebration already holding a wrecking ball. I stepped forward and looked at Peter, not as the man I had married, not as the father of my child, but as a stranger who had finally revealed himself. "I gave you every chance to be honest," I said. "I stayed while you chased every empty idea and whim. I gave you time, trust, and a life most people would treasure. You decided that wasn't enough." Peter looked like he might cry, but I didn't care. Amelia stepped closer to me. "You can go now," she said to him. And that was it. They turned and left. The door shut behind them with a dull thud, like the final page of a long, painful chapter. I took a breath. For the first time in years, it filled my lungs all the way. I turned to Amelia and pulled her into a hug. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded against my shoulder. "I am now." And I believed her. I was okay, too. Not whole yet, not healed, but no longer stuck in the life of someone else's performance. And the spotlight was finally mine. "I did handle it," Peter snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "But she's being unreasonable." His words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and clinging to everything. Amelia stepped forward then, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass.
"No."
"She's being smart." Peter flinched. "You lied to both of us, Dad. You used Mom for years, and now you're trying to make her look like the villain for finally standing up for herself." He reached for her hand, his face twisting in regret, but Amelia pulled away so fast he looked startled. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't pretend to care now. Not after everything." Cassandra stood frozen, arms limp by her side, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to speak but didn't know how. She looked at Peter like she was seeing him for the first time without the soft light of manipulation and half-truths. "You said you hadn't touched the joint accounts," she whispered. "You said this was clean." Peter didn't look at her. He stared at the floor. "It was supposed to be." "No," I said, stepping forward. "It was supposed to be secret. You were going to blindside me, pretend to be civil while planning your exit." But I saw it coming. I turned fully toward him, my voice clear and steady. "And I'm not unfreezing anything. Not until the hearing. Not until the law says otherwise." Peter's eyes met mine, eyes I used to know so well. But what stared back at me now wasn't love. It wasn't even anger. It was panic. "Can't we talk alone?" he asked quietly. "There's nothing left to say," I said, stepping away. "You already spoke loud and clear. And now so have I." I walked back to the kitchen, leaving them standing in the hallway with the weight of their own choices. The kind of weight that doesn't leave room for excuses. Amelia followed me without hesitation. That moment, the quiet way she walked beside me meant more than any words she could have said. That was the day we both stopped protecting him. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. Not just the air conditioning, but the energy. No warmth, no comfort, just polished wood, ticking clocks, and measured voices. I wore a simple navy suit. My hair was pinned back, and I skipped makeup except for a swipe of lip balm. I wasn't dressing for battle. I was dressing for closure. My lawyer, a woman named Rachel Moore, sat beside me, flipping calmly through a thick binder. Every page was a piece of the truth, organized, time-stamped, and irrefutable. Peter arrived 10 minutes late. His tie was crooked. His shirt creased like he'd slept in it. His lawyer looked younger than he probably was, and completely unprepared. It was obvious he had either received the file on the way in, or hadn't cared enough to read it thoroughly. Cassandra wasn't with him this time. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, walked in and commanded attention without raising her voice. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine the status of the prenuptial agreement and assess the financial arrangements pending divorce," she said, her tone clipped and efficient. Peter's lawyer stood and tried to argue that the prenup was outdated, signed nearly 3 decades ago, and irrelevant in today's context. His voice trembled slightly when he mentioned changing financial expectations and informal agreements. Rachel didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she stood, calm and confident. "Your Honor, the agreement is still valid and enforceable. It includes a detailed fidelity clause. My client has provided substantial documentation of Mr. Caldwell's ongoing affair, along with financial transactions that demonstrate intentional concealment and misconduct." She walked to the bench and handed over the binder. The judge opened it and began flipping through page after page, screenshots, bank transfers, receipts, photos, messages, timestamps. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the soft turning of each sheet. Finally, the judge looked up. "Everything appears to be in order. The agreement is valid. The fidelity clause will be honored." She paused, her eyes briefly locking with Peter's. "Effective immediately. All jointly held accounts will remain frozen. The marital residence is to remain under Mrs. Caldwell's sole control. Mr. Caldwell is prohibited from accessing, liquidating, or transferring shared funds until further review. Peter turned pale. He tried to say something, but his mouth didn't quite cooperate. His lawyer leaned in to whisper, but Peter didn't react. He just sat there, shoulders sinking inch by inch. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply sat still and listened. Not as a victor, but as someone who had waited long enough for accountability. The hearing ended without fanfare. No tears. No raised voices. Just consequences, quiet, heavy, and earned. Outside the courthouse, I made it halfway to my car before I heard him calling after me. "Emily, wait, please." I turned. Peter walked toward me, hands half raised like he was afraid I'd run. "This doesn't have to be so final," he said. "We can still talk. Work something out." I exhaled slowly. "I already did, Peter. I stayed for 28 years. That was the compromise." His expression twisted. "I made a mistake. I lost my way. But this? Freezing everything? Taking the house?" I looked him straight in the eye. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a plan. You just didn't expect mine to be stronger." He didn't have a comeback for that. He stood there in silence as I got into my car and drove away. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing. A friend of a friend. "I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" Someone from Amelia's old school. "He brought the other woman to her graduation dinner? What kind of man does that?" The whispers were spreading. The neighborhood, the book club, even Peter's golfing circle. People began seeing him differently. Not just as a man who had an affair, but as a man who had staged his betrayal in public and expected applause. He had spent years crafting his image: family man, investor, devoted husband. The smiling holiday cards, the public declarations, the careful curation of our lives. But now the facade was cracking fast. And I didn't have to lift a finger. All I did was tell the truth. And let it land. Later that night, Amelia came into my room carrying 2 mugs of tea. She sat at the foot of the bed, legs crossed like she used to when she was 5, and wanted to tell me a secret. "People are texting me," she said. "I know. I told them not to bother you. That you're stronger than he ever deserved." I smiled at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "But I wanted to." We sat quietly for a while, sipping tea and letting the world outside spin its chaos. For once, we were calm in the middle of it. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, voice low. "I didn't know how much you were carrying until now." I reached over and touched her hand. "I carried it because I loved him. I carried it until it broke me. But I'm not carrying it anymore." She nodded, her eyes glassy.
Good.
"Because he doesn't get to break you and still keep you." That night, I slept deeply. The kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from peace. The kind that tells you the worst is past, and the rest, whatever it is, will be yours to shape. I didn't win in that courtroom. I reclaimed. And that mattered so much more. A few weeks after the first court hearing, I got a quiet update from Diana. She didn't sound surprised when she said, "Cassandra's gone." The fairy tale Peter had promised her, the one with private jets, European getaways, and a sprawling luxury home, began to collapse the moment the accounts were frozen. The illusion of wealth, the curated lifestyle Peter flaunted, turned out to be built on borrowed time and shared sacrifices. Most of what she believed he owned wasn't his to begin with. The home she had hoped to decorate was tied up in legal proceedings. The credit cards stopped working. The spa appointments vanished. So did the constant attention he used to give her. Once the reality set in, Cassandra packed up her things and left quietly, without even a final scene. There was no showdown, no tearful confrontation, just absence. I wasn't surprised. Peter had lied to both of us, but the difference was I had lived through the fallout for decades. I had cleaned up his financial messes. I had covered for him during dry spells and paid bills when he miscalculated our future. Cassandra tasted that for a few weeks and walked away. I couldn't blame her, but I also didn't feel sorry. Her exit was just another sign that I had been right to stop protecting him. While Peter's world was shrinking, mine was finally beginning. For years, I had pushed away the quiet dream of starting something of my own. I used to doodle business plans in the margins of notebooks when Amelia was a baby. I had the skills, the discipline, the knowledge, but not the space, not the support. Now I had both. I launched my financial consultancy, a small office tucked in a converted brick building near the center of town. I called it Bright Ledger, a name that felt gentle but firm. It wasn't about flash or prestige. It was about truth, about clarity. My firm catered to women in transition, divorcees, widows, women emerging from toxic relationships or years of financial dependency. Many of them came in scared, embarrassed, unsure of where to even begin. They didn't just need spreadsheets. They needed reassurance, strategy, and a mirror to show them they were capable. Tanya was my first client. She walked in with shaking hands, carrying a plastic folder filled with scattered bank statements and an unread prenup. She'd been married for 17 years to a man who made her feel like a child whenever money came up. After our first session, she cried, not because she was afraid, but because she finally understood something she had been told not to believe. "You mean this is mine?" she asked, holding a statement that listed her portion of the marital assets. "Yes," I said. "It always should have been." One client turned into 3, then 10, then 20. Words spread faster than I expected. Not just about the work, but about the feeling. I didn't just help women budget or negotiate. I helped them rebuild their sense of power. Amelia began visiting the office after her classes and internship shifts. Sometimes she'd bring lunch, just herself, curious and quiet. She started sitting in on meetings when clients were comfortable with it, watching, learning. One afternoon, she stayed longer than usual. I was going over a portfolio with a woman preparing to leave a decade-long marriage, and when the client left, Amelia leaned back in her chair and grinned. "I didn't realize how much you knew," she said, admiration shining through. "You should have been doing this years ago." "I was busy surviving," I said, sipping my tea. "Now I get to live." The final court hearing came exactly a month later. It wasn't long or dramatic. By then, Peter's lawyers had stopped trying to argue. The evidence was too solid. The prenup, ironically written at his insistence, became the very tool that destroyed his plan to control the outcome. The judge awarded me 70% of all shared assets. That included our house, our investment portfolio, and the full balance of Peter's retirement accounts. I hadn't asked for more than what was fair. I had only asked for what I earned. Peter didn't look at me once during the hearing. He sat with his head low, shoulders hunched in a suit that suddenly seemed too big for him. The man who had once walked into rooms with his chest puffed now looked like someone trying not to be seen. The hearing ended in less than an hour. I stood up, thanked my lawyer, and walked toward the exit. Outside, I barely made it to the courthouse steps before Peter blocked my path. "Emily," he said softly, "please." I stopped, not because I was tempted, but because I needed the closure. "I was wrong," he continued. "I should have treated you better. I thought you'd never leave." I studied his face. Not with anger. Not with the grief I once feared. Just clarity. "I did leave," I said. "You just didn't notice until I stopped waiting for you to catch up." He looked like he had more to say, but nothing came. "I hope you find peace, Peter," I added. "But it won't be through me." Then I walked away and didn't turn around. My mornings are different now. I wake up without dread. I don't reach for my phone in fear. I sip my coffee slowly. I breathe. I walk through the rooms of a home that is now mine alone, not just in paperwork, but in peace. At Bright Ledger, the walls are painted warm earth tones. The windows are always open. The women who walk through the door carry their own stories, and every one of them finds a little bit of herself again inside that office. Amelia and I spend our weekends together, sometimes thrifting, sometimes gardening, sometimes just lying in the sun doing nothing at all. We laugh louder now. We cry less. One Sunday afternoon, we sat on the porch of the house I now fully owned. The wind was soft, the sun was low in the sky, and the garden was beginning to bloom. "You're not just my mom," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You're the strongest woman I know." I smiled and whispered back, "I finally believe that." There was a time when I couldn't say that, when I couldn't see my strength through the haze of someone else's needs, through the noise of being silenced or sidelined.
But now?
This chapter is mine. Fully mine. Not shared. Not borrowed. Not negotiated. Just mine.